Think about this. What happens when you step into a completely new place? A different country, a different culture. Suddenly, everything you take for granted, the way people build houses, what they eat, how they talk, what they believe, all looks utterly foreign, maybe even a little strange.
Yeah, it really shifts your perspective.
That fundamental human drive to travel, whether for work, trade, escape, or just pure adventure, it changes how you see everything.
It does, because you're seeing the world through your own lens, your own experiences. And what's just everyday life to a local is, well, a revelation, a curiosity to the visitor.
Right.
Travelers leave us these incredible snapshots, capturing the details that locals wouldn't even think to write down.
Exactly. And that's our mission in this deep dive. We're exploring how accounts left by travelers who visited the Indian subcontinent between roughly the 10th and 17th centuries can unlock fascinating insights into the past.
Yeah, we're diving into a source text titled Unit 1 Through the Eyes of Travelers, and it focuses on the observations of three really remarkable individuals.
Okay, so who are we focusing on?
Yes, we'll be looking at Al-Biruni, a scholar from what is now Uzbekistan, who visited in the 11th century.
Okay, Al-Biruni.
Then there's Ibn Battuta, the legendary global explorer from Morocco in the 14th century.
Ah, Ibn Battuta, everyone's heard of him.
And finally, François Bernier, a French doctor and philosopher who arrived in the 17th century.
So, three very different people, different eras, different backgrounds.
Absolutely. Each of them saw the subcontinent through vastly different eyes, with different purposes and, frankly, biases.
So the question is, what can we learn about that time by comparing their unique perspectives? Let's jump in.
Great. Let's start with Al-Biruni. He was born way back in 973 in Khwarizm, which was a major center of learning at the time, modern Uzbekistan.
And he wasn't just anyone, right? He was a serious scholar.
Oh, definitely. A true polymath for his time. Mastered multiple languages: Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew.
And crucially, Sanskrit.
Yes, crucially, Sanskrit for his later work. The source also mentions he knew Greek philosophy, though likely through Arabic translations.
So how did he end up focused on India? It wasn't exactly next door.
Well, his connection wasn't straightforward. It started when Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni invaded Khwarizm in 1017. Al-Biruni was actually brought to Ghazni as a hostage.
Wow, okay. Not a voluntary trip then, initially.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But interestingly, he seems to have developed a liking for the city and ended up spending the rest of his life there. He died when he was 70.
And his interest in India grew there.
It seems so. Especially after Punjab became part of the Ghaznavid Empire, he came into contact with the local population there, and that fostered his interest.
And being the scholar he was, he didn't just casually observe.
No way. He spent years learning from Brahmana scholars, really digging into Sanskrit texts. He even translated some Sanskrit works into Arabic. He was, dedicated to understanding this new world, but very much from an academic angle.
Which led to his big work.
Exactly. His monumental work, the Kitab al-Hind. It's written in Arabic and described as simple and lucid, which is quite something given the complexity of the topic.
And the scope sounds immense.
It really is. 80 chapters covering, well, everything. Religion, philosophy, festivals, astronomy, alchemy, customs, social life, weights and measures, iconography, laws, metrology. Just vast.
You know, what I found most striking about the Kitab al-Hind from the source is its structure. It sounds almost scientific.
It is quite unique. Al-Biruni apparently approached each topic almost like a math problem. He'd start with a question.
Okay.
Then he'd provide a description based on the Sanskritic traditions he'd learned.
Right.
And then he'd wrap up by comparing it to other cultures he knew, Greek, Persian, etc.
The source mentioned that this sort of geometric structure might even reflect his mathematical background.
It's a fascinating thought how his method really shaped his whole perspective. And he was explicit about his goals, too.
What did he say he was trying to achieve?
Well, Source 1 lays it out. His aim was basically to help those who wanted to discuss religious questions with Hindus, and also just to serve as a kind of reference guide, a repertory of information for people associating with him. He saw himself bridging a knowledge gap.
But he knew it wasn't easy, right? He identified some real challenges in understanding Indian society.
Oh, absolutely. He was very clear about the barriers. What stood out to you?
Well, language, first off. He found Sanskrit incredibly different from Arabic and Persian.
Yes, he called it complex, with an enormous range, both in words and inflections.
Yeah.
He felt it made translation really difficult, almost like the language itself was a barrier.
And he connected that to the second barrier, the difference in religious beliefs and practices. Fundamentally different worldviews.
Exactly. And the third barrier he pointed to was what he perceived as a kind of insularity, maybe even self-absorption, among the local population, a feeling they were somewhat closed off.
But here's the interesting part. Despite seeing these barriers, where did he get most of his information?
Right back to the source he found difficult. He relied heavily on those Brahmana scholars and the classical Sanskritic texts, the Vedas, Puranas, Bhagavad Gita, works of Patanjali, the Manusmriti. Which means he was often describing the ideal system, the normative rules laid out in those texts, not necessarily the messy, everyday reality on the ground.
And you can really see that in how he approached the caste system.
Definitely. He tried to make sense of it by comparing it to social divisions he knew from ancient Persia, arguing, social hierarchies weren't unique to India.
He wasn't just describing, though. He had some critiques.
He did, particularly the concept of social pollution or ritual pollution. He just couldn't accept it logically.
Why not?
He argued it was contrary to natural laws. He used examples like the sun cleaning the air or salt preventing water corruption. Nature cleanses, he argued, so why should human interaction cause pollution? It didn't make sense to him.
So how did he describe the main social divisions, the Varnas?
Well, Source 5 gives his account based on the texts. The 4 Varnas originating from Brahman, Brahmanas from the head, Kshatriyas from shoulders and hands, Vaishyas from the thigh, and Shudras from the feet.
A clear hierarchy there.
A clear hierarchy, yes. But he also made a simple observation, that the lower 2 classes, Vaishyas and Shudras, actually lived together in the same towns and villages, alongside each other.
And that simple point hints at the gap between the textual theory and reality.
Exactly. The source mentions groups like the Antyaja, literally born outside the system, who weren't even in the 4 Varna framework, but were absolutely part of the economy, doing essential, often ritually polluting labor. Al-Biruni's focus on the texts might mean he missed some of that complex social fabric.
It's also worth noting how the word Hindu was used back then.
Good point. The source clarifies it was initially just geographical, referring to people living east of the Sindhu or Indus River. The religious meaning came much, much later. Al-Biruni used it in that older geographical sense.
Okay, so that's Al-Biruni, the meticulous scholar, working primarily from texts, comparing knowledge systems.
Fascinating perspective. But now let's shift gears quite dramatically. Fast forward about 300 years to the 14th century and meet Ibn Battuta.
Ugh, the globetrotter. This guy's story is just incredible. Born in Tangier, Morocco, 1304, came from an educated family, experts in Islamic law.
You'd expect him to settle down as a judge or scholar, right?
Exactly, but no, he was bitten hard by the travel bug.
Completely. He believed experience gained through travel was far more valuable than just book learning. He had this overmastering impulse, as he called it.
I love that phrase.
Me too. He left home at Chengtu, alone. Source 2 quotes him saying he forsook his home as birds forsake their nests. Just packed up and went.
And he didn't just pop over to the next country. Before he even got near the Indian subcontinent,
he had already traveled extensively across North Africa, the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, Oman, even parts of East Africa. An incredible journey already.
So when did he arrive in the subcontinent?
He reached Sind in 1333, traveling overland through Central Asia. What drew him specifically to Delhi was hearing about its Sultan, Muhammad bin Tughlaq.
Why?
The Sultan had a reputation as a generous patron, especially of arts and learning, and particularly welcoming to foreigners. Ibn Battuta was drawn by that reputation.
And did it pay off?
It did. The Sultan was impressed by his learning and appointed him the Qazi, or judge, of Delhi, a very prestigious position. He held that for several years.
But his travels didn't end there, did they?
Not by a long shot. After a bit of a falling out and then reconciliation with the Sultan, he was actually sent as the Sultan's envoy to the Mongol ruler in China in 1342.
To China? So his journey continued?
Oh, yes. Down the Malabar coast, spending time in the Maldives, where he was again a judge, then Sri Lanka, back to Malabar, and eventually Sumatra, before finally sailing to China. His travels just kept expanding.
It's easy to forget just how difficult and dangerous travel was back then.
Absolutely. The source gives us some timings. 40 days to get from Multan to Delhi, 50 days from Sind to Delhi. These were long, arduous journeys.
And perilous. He faced robbers.
Frequently. Attacks were common. He preferred traveling in larger caravans for safety, but even that wasn't always enough. He himself was attacked and wounded on one occasion, and many in his group were killed.
That detail in Source 2 about him arriving in Tunis early in his travels, sick and alone, and weeping because everyone else was greeting friends and he knew nobody, it really makes it human.
It does. It grounds the legendary explorer in real hardship and loneliness. And that terracotta figure shown in the source, the one of travelers carrying weapons on a boat,
Yeah.
it just underscores that this wasn't sightseeing. Travel often meant being armed and ready for trouble.
So after decades of this, he finally went home.
Yes, returned to Morocco around 1354. And it was upon his return that the local ruler insisted he dictate his adventures.
Which resulted in the Rila.
The Rila, exactly, his famous travelogue. And understanding its purpose is key to understanding Ibn Battuta's whole approach. Well, Ibn Juzay, who wrote down the account, states in the introduction, source 3, that the goal wasn't academic analysis like al-Biruni. It was explicitly intended to provide entertainment to the mind and delight to the ears and eyes.
So focusing on
The curious particulars and marvelous things. It was about the enjoyment of curiosities. He was looking for the novel, the strange, the wonderful.
And he clearly had a talent for describing things that would have been totally unfamiliar to his readers back home, like the coconut.
Oh, the coconut description is classic Ibn Battuta, source 7. He compares the tree to a date palm, fair enough. But the nut itself...
He said it looked like a man's head.
Exactly, because it has those 3 marks that look like 2 eyes and a mouth. And the inside, green, he compared to the brain, and the fiber outside to hair. It's such a vivid, almost whimsical comparison to make the exotic understandable.
And he noted its practical uses too, right? Making ropes and cables.
Yes, using coir fiber instead of iron nails for ships, which he observed. Practical details alongside the curious comparisons.
What about pounding? That must have seemed strange too.
Definitely. Source 6 describes how he saw it being cultivated like a grapevine, but only for its leaves, and then how people chewed it with areca nut and a bit of lime chalk. A simple, everyday thing for locals, but completely new and worth describing for his audience.
Beyond plants, what did he think of the cities?
He seems to have been quite impressed. He saw the cities in the subcontinent as buzzing with activity, full of opportunities, densely populated, and generally prosperous, though he did note occasional disruptions from wars or invasions.
Delhi, especially.
Yes, he described Delhi, source 8, as vast, having a great population and being the largest in India. He went into detail about its massive rampart, its width, the rooms and granaries built inside it, the windows for light, even the materials used.
And the gates. He mentioned some of the gates.
28 gates. He even named some like the Budan Gate, the Mandwi Gate leading to the grain market, the Gul Darwaza or Flower Gate. It paints a picture of a huge, complex, well-defended city. And he mentioned its beautiful cemetery, too.
Did any other cities impress him?
He mentioned Daulatabad in Maharashtra as being large enough to rival Delhi. And his descriptions of bazaars are fascinating.
More than just places to shop.
Oh, yes. He saw them as real economic, social, and cultural hubs, often with mosques or temples right there, and spaces for performers, musicians, dancers, singers.
Like that market in Daulatabad.
Right, the Tarbabad market, source 9. He describes female singers living there, performing on swings in the evenings, all decked out in finery. He notes a large cupola where the chief musician sat, and mentions that both Hindu and Muslim nobles would come to enjoy the performances. It gives you a sense of this vibrant, perhaps quite integrated urban life.
What about the wider economy? Did he comment on trade or agriculture?
He did. He saw Indian agriculture as highly productive fertile soil, often yielding 2 crops a year. And he clearly perceived that the subcontinent was deeply woven into the wider inter-Asian trade networks.
What kinds of goods stood out to him?
Textiles, definitely. Indian cotton, fine muslins, silks, brocade, satin to him. He noted they were in high demand across Asia and the Middle East, fetching high prices. Fine muslin, he said, was so expensive only nobles and the very rich could afford it.
But there was one piece of infrastructure that really amazed him, wasn't there?
Yes, the postal system. He was astonished by its efficiency. He saw how crucial it was for sending intelligence quickly, but also for trade goods.
How did it work? He described 2 types.
That's right, in source 10. First, the horse post, called the uluk. Royal horses were stationed every 4 miles. A courier would ride one horse to the next station, get a fresh horse, and continue. Super fast for the time.
And the other type.
The foot post, the dawa. This is actually even faster over short distances, apparently. It had relay stations 3 times closer, 3 stations per mile.
How did that work?
Each runner carried a long rod with copper bells on top. As he approached the station, he'd shake the rod, the bells would ring, and the next runner waiting in the hut would immediately get ready. The message or package was handed over, and the next runner would sprint off, ringing his bells. A continuous, incredibly rapid relay.
Wow. That sounds exhausting, but effective.
Incredibly effective. He even mentioned it was used to transport special fruits like melons for the Sultan from distant parts of the empire right to Delhi. Imagine the logistics.
Yeah.
It shows a remarkable level of state organization.
Okay, so Ibn Battuta gives us this sense of wonder, of a bustling, connected world full of curiosities. Now let's jump again another few centuries forward to the 17th century. François Bernier.
Yes, François Bernier. And he brings a very different perspective again. A Frenchman, trained as a doctor, but also very much a political philosopher and historian.
When was he in the Mughal Empire?
He arrived in 1656 and stayed for 12 years, until 1668. He came, like many Europeans then, seeking opportunities.
And he got connected to the court.
He did. He served for a time as physician to Prince Dara Shikoh, one of Shah Jahan's sons. Later, he was associated with an influential noble at the Mughal court, an Armenian named Danishman Khan, who was interested in science and philosophy.
Now, Bernier's approach, it was quite different from the others, wasn't it? Much more critical.
Fundamentally different. His primary method was comparison. He constantly compared everything he saw in India to Europe, specifically his native France. And, well, India often came off worse in his comparisons. He frequently described what he saw as a bleak situation.
Was he just observing, or did he have an agenda?
The source makes it pretty clear he had an agenda. He wasn't just writing travel notes. He was aiming to influence policymakers and intellectuals back in Europe. He used this kind of binary opposition, framing the East versus the West, to portray India as the inverse and often the inferior of Europe.
What was his biggest criticism? The source highlights one major issue he focused on.
Land ownership. That was central to his critique. He became convinced, rightly or wrongly, that under the Mughal system, there was no concept of private property in land. He believed the emperor owned all the land and merely distributed it temporarily to his nobles, the Jagirdars or Mansabdars.
And what did he see as the consequences of this supposed crown ownership?
Dire consequences. He argued that because the nobles held land only temporarily and at the emperor's pleasure, they had absolutely no incentive to invest in improving it for the long term. Why bother if it could be taken away?
So this led to?
According to Bernier, it led directly to the uniform ruination of agriculture, the excessive oppression of the peasantry, as nobles tried to extract maximum revenue quickly, and a continuous decline in the living standards for almost everyone except the very top layer of the ruling aristocracy.
He painted a pretty grim picture of the peasants.
It's extremely grim. Source 11 gives his description the peasant facing harsh treatment, struggling for basic subsistence, even having their children taken as slaves if they couldn't pay revenue. He claimed this drove them to despair, to abandon the land, sometimes fleeing to towns or the protection of local chiefs.
And he used this as a lesson for Europe.
Explicitly. Source 12 shows him using this depiction as a warning. This is what happens, he argued, when kings claim ownership of all land and rule arbitrarily. You get neglected fields, ruined towns, and widespread poverty. Don't let this happen in Europe.
So his conclusion about Indian society was quite stark.
Very stark. He famously concluded that there was no middle state in India, just the extremely poor oppressed masses at one end and a tiny, immensely rich and powerful ruling class at the other. No prosperous middle ground like he saw emerging in Europe.
Now, how accurate was his core premise about land ownership?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. The source text itself points out that Mughal official documents, like those compiled by Abul Fazl during Akbar's reign, don't actually support Bernier's interpretation. They suggest the state's claim was on a share of the produce of the land. Land revenue was seen as remuneration for providing sovereignty and protection, more like a tax on the crop, not rent on land the emperor owned.
So Bernier might have misinterpreted or oversimplified?
Seems likely. Later historians, influenced partly by Bernier's ideas, which fed into Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production, also sometimes oversimplified. The reality on the ground was much more complex, with various land rights, powerful local intermediaries like zamindars, different categories of peasants, and landless laborers. It wasn't the simple binary Bernier presented.
But even in Bernier's own writings, are there hints that reality was more complex than his main argument allowed?
Yes, intriguingly, there are. The source points this out. Despite his overall narrative of decline and ruin, Bernier himself observed things that don't quite fit. For example, Source 13 acknowledges that vast quantities of gold and silver were flowing into India from the rest of the world to pay for Indian exports.
That doesn't sound like total ruin.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It indicates significant manufacturing and vigorous international trade. He even mentions a prosperous merchant community engaged in long-distance exchange. He describes Bengal as incredibly fertile, producing rice, sugar, and silk in abundance for export.
So he saw wealth in production, too.
He did. He notes skilled artisans producing beautiful cottons, silks, and other goods, both for the domestic elite and for export. He famously remarked that gold and silver from around the world found a way to India and seemed to get swallowed up there.
How does that square with his picture of universal poverty and agricultural ruin?
It doesn't, really. It suggests his observations were sometimes at odds with his overarching thesis. He saw the economic activity, but perhaps framed it negatively, like artisans being compelled to work.
What about cities? How did he view Mughal cities?
Also quite negatively, mostly. He famously described them as camp towns, basically just large encampments that existed only because the imperial court or a large army detachment was present. He argued they lacked solid economic foundations of their own and would quickly decline if the court moved away.
Was that accurate?
Again, it's an oversimplification. The source notes that around 15% of India's population lived in towns at the time, which was actually a higher percentage than in contemporary Europe. And while some towns were administrative centers, many others were thriving manufacturing hubs, bustling train centers, port cities, or important pilgrimage sites with their own dynamics. Bernier's camp town theory missed that diversity.
Did he describe any specific urban features?
He did describe the imperial karkhanas, or workshops, source 14. He talks about large halls where different artisans worked under supervision, embroiderers, goldsmiths, painters, weavers, tailors, etc., producing luxury goods for the court.
How did he portray the work there?
Even here, his critical lens is apparent. He describes the routine, the artisans arriving in the morning and working all day. But he conveys a sense of stagnation, suggesting there was no incentive or aspiration for improvement, just activity without real progress. Again, fitting his broader narrative.
So Bernier gives us this highly critical comparative view, focused on structures he saw as flawed compared to Europe.
Exactly. A very different take from El-Biruni's scholarly detachment or Ibn Battuta's delight in curiosities.
Beyond these big economic and political structures, did these travelers comment much on social life? Things like slavery or the position of women?
They did, yes. And again, their observations were often filtered through their own cultural backgrounds, highlighting things that seemed particularly different or notable to them.
What about slavery?
Ibn Battuta, for instance, provides pretty clear evidence in Source 15. He talks about slaves being openly bought and sold in markets. He himself received and gifted slaves while in India.
Were there different kinds of slaves?
He implies so. He mentions female slaves who were experts in music and dance being valued by the Sultan. He also notes female slaves were used for domestic labor and sometimes even as informants or spies within elite households. And both male and female slaves were used for carrying people in palanquins, which was common.
Was slave ownership widespread?
The source suggests it was fairly common, at least among households that could afford it. It notes that slaves, especially female slaves for domestic work, were often relatively inexpensive, making ownership accessible beyond just the super rich.
And the condition of women, what caught the travelers' eyes?
Well, for European travelers like Bernier, the practice of sati, a widow immolating herself on her husband's funeral pyre, became a major point of focus, almost a symbol of Indian society's perceived otherness or barbarity in their eyes.
Did Bernier describe it?
He did, very powerfully and disturbingly. Source 16 contains his harrowing eyewitness account of a child sati he saw in Lahore. He estimated the girl was only about 12 years old.
Oh, that's awful.
It's deeply upsetting. He describes her terrible distress, her trembling and weeping bitterly, how she was essentially forced towards the pyre by older women, how she fainted and was then tied to the wood lest she should run away, and then the fire was lit. He writes about his own horror and difficulty suppressing his emotions witnessing it.
It's an important, though horrifying, observation. But sati wasn't the entirety of women's experience, presumably.
Absolutely not. And the source is careful to make that point. While sati was a real and shocking practice observed by travelers, women's lives were obviously much broader and more varied. Women were crucial to the economy, working in agriculture, spinning thread, weaving textiles, involved in craft production.
Were they involved in trade, too?
Yes, there's evidence of women from merchant families participating in commercial activities, so their lives weren't solely confined to the private sphere, or defined only by extreme practices like sati, even if those were the things that often captured the attention of foreign male observers.
Travelers might not have even noticed the ordinary women working in the fields or workshops.
Precisely. Their focus was often drawn to the spectacular, the different, or the elite, missing the everyday realities of many people's lives.
Okay, so bringing it all together. We have these three distinct perspectives.
Yeah, Al-Biruni, the detached scholar, working from texts, comparing abstract knowledge systems.
Then Ibn Battuta, the hands-on explorer, driven by experience, fascinated by novelty and curiosities.
And François Bernier, the critical intellectual, using comparison often to judge, focused on political and economic systems through a distinctly European, often negative lens.
It really highlights how much their own backgrounds, their reasons for traveling, and who they were writing for shaped what they saw and how they reported it.
Completely. They weren't neutral cameras. They didn't see everything. They misunderstood things. They selected details, consciously or unconsciously, that fit their existing ideas or served their purpose. They had biases, blind spots, limitations.
And this is the crucial point. Despite all those limitations,
Despite all that, their writings are incredibly valuable. They give us these rich, detailed glimpses into the social, cultural, economic world of the subcontinent centuries ago. Precisely because they were outsiders, they noticed and described things, customs, beliefs, everyday objects, systems that local writers might have taken completely for granted and never bothered to mention.
and that's the real value for us, isn't it? Seeing a place, even a historical one, through radically different eyes, even flawed or biased eyes, forces us to see layers we might otherwise miss.
Exactly. It makes you think about your own perspective. How does our background, our time shape what we notice when we travel, or even just when we learn about other cultures or times?
What aspects of our own world right now seem totally normal to us, but might strike a visitor from a different time or place as utterly bizarre or remarkable?
It's a great question to ponder. Makes you look at the familiar differently.
Okay, here's a final thought to leave everyone with. We've spent this deep dive looking at the Indian subcontinent through the eyes of travelers from North Africa and Europe. But the source material briefly mentions something fascinating. That people from the subcontinent also traveled widely. They went to Central Asia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, maybe even parts of Europe. And sometimes they wrote about their experiences, occasionally even countering the images others had created about their homeland.
That's right. Those accounts exist, though perhaps less commonly studied sometimes.
So imagine if we could do another deep dive, but focused on those accounts. Imagine seeing those distant lands, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, through the eyes of travelers from the Indian subcontinent during that same broad period.
What a fascinating reversal of perspective that would be.
What curiosities and wonders might they have found remarkable? How might they have described European customs or Ottoman society or Central Asian landscapes? And how might they have compared the West or other regions back to their home? It could completely flip the script on who is observing whom and what is considered normal or exotic.
That would certainly offer a whole new set of insights, a great thought to chew on.